This is lesson 11 in domain 10, and this lesson is titled Liberty and Justice for All. At the end of this lesson, you're going to be able to describe the roles of different people while America was gaining independence. There are going to be a few different groups of people that we're going to talk about today, and you're going to be able to describe what their role was while we were gaining independence as a new independent nation. Like always, before we get started, we do have some vocabulary words you will need to know while listening to this lesson. The first one is equally, in the same way or with the same amount. Justice, fairness, especially in the way people are treated. And liberty, freedom or the right to choose without being forced. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where have you heard those words before? Listen again and see if you remember who wrote these words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson wrote them as part of our Declaration of Independence. Remember how the founders felt that they were being treated unfairly by the British? They did not feel that they were being treated equally or the same as the British on the other side of the ocean. The colonists wanted liberty, or freedom, from the rules of the British. And so, when Jefferson sat down to write these famous words, he wanted to make sure that the new American nation would treat all its people fairly. Again, when the founders met to write our Constitution of the United States, they wrote about liberty and justice. When we hold our hands over our hearts and pledge allegiance to our country today, our final words are, with liberty and justice for all. These are important words written by our founders, but not all people were treated fairly in the American colonies. Let's look back at the 1700s, during and after the war, when the founders were busy writing these important words. Whom did they mean when they were talking about the Constitution? What did they mean by we? We, the people of the United States. Some people say they must have just been thinking about themselves, a group of white men who made the laws of the land. Were they forgetting the other people on the continent? Native Americans who had lived there the longest, women, and African American slaves? These were very smart men, writing words that they knew would be read and reread by others for many years to come. They were writing for the future. Nevertheless, it is true that not everyone in the colonial times was treated equally, and even today, people are still seeking liberty and justice for all. During the Revolutionary War, women had different roles than they have today. Although today, many women serve in our military and help protect us by fighting in wars, this wasn't the case during the Revolutionary War. Some women wanted to be soldiers, but they were not allowed to join the army. We know that some women actually disguised themselves by dressing like men so they could fight alongside them. One of the most famous of these women was Deborah Sampson, who fought in the war under the name of Robert Shurtleff. Women also were not allowed to vote, and in fact, all women did not receive the right to vote in America for nearly 150 years after the Constitution was written. Was that really liberty and justice for all? There were many people from Africa who were brought to America as slaves for the colonists. When the colonists decided to fight for their freedom from Great Britain, they themselves were keeping freedom from a large number of African slaves because the slaves did not have the freedom to choose how to live their lives. Slavery was especially common in the South, where huge plantations had large amounts of land to farm, and colonists depended upon the work of the slaves. In the New England and Middle states, slavery started to disappear after the Revolutionary War, but it continued for a long time in the South, where these large farms were located. Slaves also were not allowed to vote. Was this liberty and justice for all? For a long time, Native Americans lived on the North American continent alone. Yet life for them began changing when the first European explorers arrived hundreds of years before the Revolutionary War. You will remember that some of them chose to help the colonists and trade with them when they first arrived. However, it wasn't long before the colonists started exploring lands to the west, pushing Native Americans off of their own land. Native Americans were also not allowed to vote. Was this liberty and justice for all? So what do you think? Was the decision of our nation's founders to fight a 6-year war for independence a wise decision? It probably was. The government they set up 200 years ago has served as a model for the rest of the world ever since. It was certainly not fair to all people in the early years, and there are still many ways in which it can be improved, but it is up to us, we, the people, to make each day a better day for all of us. After all, liberty and justice have a lot to do with how we treat one another every single day. So that was the early beginnings of our liberty and justice for all. You heard a lot about women, Native Americans, and African Americans during this time. Think of how their lives were. And when you go back to Seesaw to complete the activity, I want you to describe the roles that they had. How did African Americans, Native Americans, and women's lives differ from those of white men who created the Constitution during this time? Do you think it was fair? Give this a little bit of thought and then go to Seesaw and complete the activity on this lesson.